Welcome to Mental Disabilities and the Criminal Justice System. I'm Elizabeth Kelley, and I'm a criminal defense lawyer who specializes in representing people with mental disabilities. On mental disabilities and the criminal justice system, we provide information and hope to people with mental disabilities ensnared in the criminal justice system, as well as to their families. In this episode, we are joined by Judge Steve Leifman of the Miami-Dade County Court, who is a nationwide, if not a worldwide leader in diverting people with mental disabilities from the criminal justice system. Welcome, Judge Leifman.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, and I am so glad that you are joining us. And I know this is going to be a great discussion. How did you become involved in this issue?
I actually became involved looking at the intersection between criminal justice and mental health as a result of a case I had 22 years ago. Tragically, the defendant turned out to be a Harvard-educated psychiatrist who had had a late onset of schizophrenia and had become homeless and got picked up on a low-level, ridiculous offense and ended up having a full-blown psychotic episode in my courtroom. And it really became a window to everything that was wrong with both the mental health system and the criminal justice system. And it put me on a journey and a path that has just been phenomenal.
Well, what you just telegraphed to us through that anecdote is that mental disabilities, mental illness, unfortunately afflicts people from all socioeconomic backgrounds, people of all educational levels. It's not just the people we see in the homeless encampments or the people wandering the subways. It attacks, it afflicts everyone and every family. Judge, give us some background. How, as a nation, did we arrive at this point?
It's a pretty fascinating yet tortured history. I don't know how far you want me to go back, but I will make it brief. The English starting in the 13th century actually had started to set up not a terrible system in dealing with people with these types of disabilities. And so if you had an intellectual disability or a serious mental illness, the Crown would take your property and they would use the proceeds to help care for you on your property. Well, when the US was colonized and founded, there was no infrastructure to do the same. And so what ended up happening is we just started incarcerating people with these disabilities. And it sadly became kind of culturally accepted that this is what we did with people with mental illnesses. And that, stigma, that culture tragically still permeates today. And so in around 1840, this amazing woman by the name of Dorothea Dix was visiting a Boston jail. And she came across these 14 men who were literally freezing to death in this Boston jail. They had no heat. They were segregated from the rest of the population. They had very little clothes and blankets, and they were freezing to death. So she went to the jailer and she's like, "Excuse me, who are these men and why are you allowing them to freeze to death?" And he's like, "Look, lady, they're just a bunch of lunatics," which is the horrible phrase they used back then. Ironically, he says to her, "Look, they didn't commit any crimes. I don't know what you want me to do about it. I'm not getting paid to keep them here." So he was literally freezing them to death. And this one woman, this one person was so outraged at what she saw, she adopted a movement that had begun in Paris called moral treatment. And the idea was to treat people with these disabilities morally. And so what they started to do in France was to build these small 120-bed asylums and get people out of custody. And so she went to the Massachusetts legislature and she got them to passed the first legislation to create these asylums. And they took people from jail and they put them in these small 120 bed facilities. And people started to get better. I mean, they weren't under the trauma that they had in jail. They were treated more humanely. And, you know, they were able to cope and better respond. Well, tragically, again, the states can't help themselves sometimes. And they consolidated these facilities because they wanted to save money, and they grew from 120 bed facilities to 10, 15,000 bed facilities without oversight, without regulation. And many of them became these human experimentation facilities, and they did horrible things to people, everything from insulin shock therapy to electric shock therapy to finally lobotomies. And it remained this way until the 1960s. President Kennedy's sister, Rose, had mental health issues and had been lobotomized, and it was done horribly, and she was just tortured. And so the Kennedys were very sensitive, and he was able to pass the first national act to create this wonderful network of community mental health facilities. Well, tragically, due to the president's assassination and the escalation of the Vietnam War, not one penny really got spent on these the development of these facilities. And at the same time, a whole slew of lawsuits got filed. The seminal case comes out of Alabama, Wyatt v. Stuckney. It's really worth reading. It's an amazing opinion. And it extends constitutional protection to people in state civil hospitals. Already at that point, if you were in jail, you were entitled to adequate health care, but no such constitutional protection existed if you were in a state civil hospital. And Judge Johnson, who had this case, did an amazing job, extends that authority and basically tells the states they have two choices. You could spend billions of dollars and upgrade your facilities to treat this population humanely, or you can release them back to the community with community supports. Well, sadly, President Kennedy's community mental health program never got fully funded. The states, trying to save money, did not spend the money to upgrade the facilities, and they just started to release this population into the community. And so you have that combined with massive housing cuts in the 80s, the war on crime, the war on drugs, sentencing guidelines, and it created this perfect storm. And now we have, we went from having very few people with mental illnesses in jails to having a significant percentage of people in jails with these disabilities.
Thank you for that summary. And by the way, I have never asked someone for background and they start by giving history of 13th century England. So thank you for that.
You are welcome.
But that history is important. That journey is important. For our listeners, we're going to put up a link to Wyatt v. Stuckney in the show notes. And also we're going to put up a link to another book that details that history, American Psychosis by E. Fuller Torrey.
Oh, great.
So now we have reached a point where we are basically at what I call trans-institutionalization. That is to say, we've deinstitutionalized hundreds and thousands of people, but unfortunately, they have ended up in our jails and our prisons. Effectively, a public health issue has become a criminal justice issue. So, Judge Leifman, what are you in Miami-Dade County doing about this?
So, you're absolutely right. It was this trans-institutionalization, and in some ways we've made matters worse than when we had before. After I had this case involving the psychiatrist in 2000, fortuitously, the first national meeting of its kind on this issue was held in Miami, and we were able to get some consulting support from Policy Research Associates, also known as the Gain Center. And we put together a 2-day summit. We mapped out the intersection between criminal justice and mental health. And we found that we were embarrassingly dysfunctional, that we so-called healthy, sane people had designed a system to fail, and it failed perfectly. And we were spending millions of dollars unnecessarily watching people cycle in and out of these very deep-ended systems. So what we decided to do is to put together a two-part system, a pre and post arrest aversion system. It was not about a mental health court. That's sort of the least of what we do. The pre-arrest, we looked around the country. We realized that at the time, the best program was crisis intervention team policing out of Memphis. We have 36 departments. We now have all 36 departments trained. We have close to 8,000 officers trained at all the departments. And we have a significant pre-arrest aversion system. And just to give you an idea of that success is we looked at a 10-year period, basically the last 10 years, and our two largest departments handled 105,268,000 mental health calls over 10 years, yet they only made 198 arrests. And as a result, the number of arrests in Dade County precipitously dropped from about 118,000 a year to 53,000. We closed one of our three main jails now for 8 years, which is an actual cost savings of $12 million a year, which is about 96 million in actual savings so far. Our police shootings have almost stopped because we've realized that PTSD also plays a big role in law enforcement shootings. And so by getting our officers trained and treated, because in part of our training, we realized that my CIT coordinator was getting about 150 calls a month from police officers for their own personal mental health issues. It was a real problem. And so what we did is we set up a way to get our officers treated outside their departments because they wouldn't go to their departments for help. And that program has not only, reduced police shootings and reduced our number of arrests. Our jail audit went from about 7,400 to 4,400, and we've saved the county almost 400 years of jail bed days. We also set up a post-arrest aversion system. And so if you now get arrested on a misdemeanor like the psychiatrist did, we no longer order psychological evaluations for competency, which to me is a big waste of time and money, particularly on misdemeanors. Instead, we get an assessment done for treatment. And if the person qualifies, we transfer them from the jail to one of our crisis stabilization units. And we reset the case in about 2 weeks, which really most of this population needs for treatment, but they're technically still in custody. We get them treated, we get them stabilized, and if they agree voluntarily to come into our post-arrest diversion program, we call it JDP, Jail Diversion Program, they are not rebooked. They're taken directly to court where one of our 8 peers are waiting for them. And until recently, 4 of our 8 peers are graduates of the program. They're amazing. They are the secret sauce of our recipe. And we provide this population all the supports that they need for recovery. Our recidivism dropped from about 75 to 20%. It worked so well that the state attorney allowed us to expand it to nonviolent felony cases. The felony program, for those that complete it, only have a 6% recidivism rate. That program has saved the county about 84 years of jail bed days. And I will tell you, if I had to do this again, I would have had a third part where I would have brought in our school board and superintendent, and I would have worked on providing assessments like ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, to middle school kids so that we could stop a generation of growing up into our system because trauma plays such a big role.
Those are absolutely amazing statistics, Judge Leifman. And if the humanitarian argument does not persuade people, then certainly the economic statistics that you cite should be persuasive. A few moments ago, you criticized the concept of competency in the legal system. First of all, tell us what the legal definition of competency is, and then tell us why you are so critical of that concept.
So it is a wonderful, fundamental constitutional right for competency restoration if you're arrested and you're not competent to stand trial. At the time that was put into play in the 1950s, we estimate there were only about 5,000 people in jails and prisons with serious mental illnesses. Last year, there were about 1.5 million people and about 2 million incidents arrested with serious mental illnesses. And on any given day, we have about 375,000 people with mental illnesses in jails and prisons, and another 474,000 under correctional supervision like probation. And so we're still using the same system that we used 50 years ago when there were very few people. And so it becomes very expensive. It does nothing to treat people. And what we have found in a study we did in Florida, which I think is probably pretty typical of the rest of the country, that in about 70% of cases that we restore people, most of the time it's on low-level offenses. Some states do misdemeanor restoration. And in Florida, we only do felonies, but for about 70% of the people we quote unquote restore, Florida spends a third of its entire adult mental health budget on about 3,500 people. And for about 70% of these people, they either have the charges dropped, they receive credit for time served, or they get probation, and they walk out of the front door of the courthouse without any access to treatment. So it's not that I am against restoration. I think it's a very important constitutional element. I think it needs to be reserved and limited for people that are facing long-term jail or prison sentences. For the rest, which is the vast majority, I think we would be much better off spending our money on finding out what is wrong with the individual in terms of their mental health disability, and then putting a treatment plan together to get them treated as opposed to restoring them.
And what do you mean by restoration? And what does the typical course of restoration involve? And finally, is the restoration process the same for all individuals? That is to say, do you try and quote unquote restore someone with a serious mental illness the same way you quote unquote restore someone with an intellectual disability?
So those are a lot of great questions. So let me go back to the original question that I didn't answer that you asked me. What is the criteria for to be incompetent or competent? There's several major Supreme Court opinions. The big one is Dusky, but there have been subsequent opinions, and there is an opinion that actually goes back to, I think, 1891 on competency. And in order to be competent to stand trial, you must be able to understand the nature and consequences of the charge against you, and you must be able to assist in your own defense to be able to help your lawyer prepare a defense for you. If you're incapable of doing either or neither, you're adjudicated incompetent and you're going to go to a facility. And while treatment is provided at these facilities, much of the time and energy and resources are spent on trying to get you to understand how court works, what your charges mean, and how to assist in your own defense. And each state does it a little differently. My state, for instance, only allows people with a serious mental illness for restoration. If you have an intellectual disability, you would not go to restoration because there really isn't, treatment for an intellectual disability. So it's kind of hard to say if somebody could ever really understand that what they would need in that criteria if they had an intellectual disability. And so it is a little bit all over the place depending on the states, but fundamentally, states are getting crushed right now trying to keep up with the restoration process. And there is a phenomenal case out of Washington State, I guess in the circuit that you're in out in California, the ninth, written by the chief judge in Washington State. It's called Washington Trueblood v. Washington, or Washington v. Trueblood. No, it's Trueblood v. Washington. And what that case stands for is that people cannot sit indefinitely waiting to be evaluated or cannot sit indefinitely waiting to be restored. And so it's put on enormous pressure on the states to approach this differently. And hopefully the states aren't just trying to build more beds to deal with it, but are setting up more diversion systems so that less people even have to go through it.
If you've just tuned in, we're talking with Judge Steve Leifman of the Miami-Dade County Court. Judge Leifman is a nationwide leader in the struggle to divert people with mental disabilities from the criminal justice system. He serves on a host of different committees and task force. He is a prolific writer, and in 2015, Chief Justice John Roberts awarded him the William H. Rehnquist Award for Judicial Excellence. Judge Leifman, several times you have mentioned mental health courts. There have been an explosion of mental health courts in this country in recent years. Briefly describe what a mental health court does, and more to the point, is a mental health court right for everyone?
So many people may be familiar with drug courts, and this is a diversion type court where for mental health, people that have been diagnosed with a mental illness may get sent to a special court. We call them problem-solving courts, where instead of focusing so much on the charge or some type of rehabilitative program, we're more focused on making sure that the person gets treated. And you're right, and there is an explosion of them, but it's not the whole answer. Part of the problem with mental health courts is they generally only take about 0.1% of the population that needs it, and they often take the wrong 0.1% that need it. We have a lot of research and data at this point. We really don't need what we consider to be low risk, low need individuals in a mental health court. For charges like that, if it's a low level offense, the research shows us that that person's not going to reoffend. And what we generally try to do in Miami is maybe hold the case open, make sure they get back in treatment, and at some point we'll just dismiss it. But you really want the mental health courts to be focused on moderate to high risk individuals, meaning not that they're high risk of any violence, but that they're high risk of reoffending, and that the needs regarding their mental illness is more acute. And so what we've done in Miami as an example, and maybe in comparison, is we take everybody in misdemeanor court. It's not just for a small percentage, and we actually try to exclude the low risk, low need people. And on the felony side, we have a pretty significant population that we help as well. We just focus more on the nature of the charge, whether or not it's serious or not. So if it's a nonviolent offense in Miami, we will accept the person into our program. But the idea and the concept is great. It's that you're going to have a court monitoring individuals, making sure that they get what they need. As I mentioned, because of all the research and data, a mental illness in and of itself is not a risk factor for committing a crime. And I've come to the conclusion that probably if you had cancer and you spent all of your money trying to get treated and you went broke doing it and you had really poor access to care and you ended up homeless over it, you too would probably end up in the criminal justice system just trying to survive. And that's what we mostly have for people with mental illnesses. Generally speaking, they're no more dangerous than the general population. That statistic goes up if they have a co-occurring issue and they use drugs. But on medication, people with mental illnesses are much less dangerous than the general population, and they are much, much, much more likely to be victims of violent crimes than perpetrators. A lot of this has to do is we have a really crummy mental health system in the United States. Access is poor. The level of care isn't that good. And it's more of a process problem than it is a treatment problem. The treatments are there and they're pretty decent. The problem is helping people get access to this treatment, helping them get housing, helping them with many of the social determinants that are really pushing them into the criminal justice system.
Well, and one of the keys is early identification and early treatment. And that's why I applaud the statement you made in the beginning of this episode that if you could redesign and refashion the system, you would have a more robust program of testing young people in grade and middle schools to see if they were vulnerable to mental illness.
And you're so right, because look, these are illnesses just like any illness. And the earlier we identify it and the earlier we treat it, the better your prognosis is. We know today that we didn't know 50 years ago is that for many people that are psychotic for long periods of time, the gray matter is getting destroyed and people are becoming permanently disabled. And if we had identified some of these issues earlier and helped people get treated earlier, they would be in much better shape and they would be in a much better state of recovery.
And a quick point back to mental health courts. When I am counseling families, I emphasize that mental health courts are a wonderful idea, but make no mistake, it is work. And sometimes the course of treatment in a mental health court is more rigorous than standard probation.
It can be, and sometimes it is more rigorous than just taking credit for time served. The problem is with these illnesses, if you just take your credit time served and you're not taking treatment, you're going to continue to cycle in and out. So I think there has to be a happy medium that we don't overdo it for individuals and we take the right people in these programs, which is one of the reasons I like using these assessment tools that we use to keep the lower risk people out. One is the data shows us that for the low risk person, they may end up actually spending more time in jail if they go into this program because they don't commit new crimes, but what happens is they miss an appointment, they miss court, a warrant gets issued, and they sit longer in jail. Plus, the data shows us that we don't want lower risk people associating with moderate or high risk people because the data also shows us that the low risk person doesn't teach the high risk guy better habits. It's the other way around. High risk person finds someone they can prey on and turn them into a criminal, and we don't want that to happen. And so we need to be smart about these programs. We need to look at the data and we need to take the right people so we get the better outcomes.
Well, and as you were responding, I realized that part of the frustration is there is no one-size-fits-all solution. And we need a host of programs, a host of strategies to sensibly attack this situation. Final question for you, Judge Leifman. If a loved one with a mental disability is charged with a crime, what should that family do and what should that family not do?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it often depends what jurisdiction you're living in. The best thing to do is to speak to the lawyer that's representing the individual, let them know about the individual's disability. See if you can find out if there's some kind of diversion program or mental health court that would be appropriate for the person, and make sure that, you know, the person's given access to those programs if they exist. If those programs don't exist, you should talk to the lawyer, talk to the state attorney, talk to the court, and see if something can be structured for that person that would focus more on getting them treatment and not having them end up with a criminal record. Because once a person gets a criminal record, it's much harder to get housing. It's much harder to get employment. There's a greater likelihood that the person may end up cycling through the criminal justice system. But I want to end up on a really positive note.
Please.
Just about 6-7 weeks ago, the Conference of Chief Justices and the Conference of State Court Administrators unanimously passed a resolution endorsing the concept of setting up a whole new diversion system in every court in America, helping judges do a better job identifying people with these disabilities and working with this population more appropriately. And they also passed a resolution calling for a 4-year implementation plan. And the idea is to have all 33,000 courtrooms in America change how they approach this issue to help us get a better outcome and to treat this population more appropriately and to allow people an opportunity of a life of hope and recovery, which is something that is new. It's exhilarating that they've taken this on. And I think in 10 years, we're going to look back and we're going to have a very different system in place than what we have today.
One can only hope. And if you send us a copy of that resolution, we'll put it up in the show notes. But in the meantime, Judge Leifman, thank you for your time. Thank you for your leadership on this issue.
And thank you for doing this. It's wonderful. And I'll send you some material.
Wonderful. Take care. Bye-bye.